Hello and welcome to the Future of RegTech in association with KPMG. I'm Sarah Freeman, Managing Editor of Business and Finance, and I'm joined today by Ian Nelson, Head of Financial Services KPMG, and two leaders in compliance in RegTech, both of whom were award winners at the recent FS Awards. Chris Hanlon, CEO of CalQRisk, and John Byrne, CEO of Corlytics. You're all very welcome. Well, Ian, let's start with you. It's January 2025. Can you set the scene a little bit? It feels like there's an ongoing deluge of new regulatory obligations being passed. What does the landscape look like for the rest of the year, and what should we be looking out for?
Great question, Sarah. And I have to say, I'm really excited about what 2025 has ahead of us. In some respects, though, it's a bit like the Charles Dickens quote, the best of times and the worst of times. For anyone that's managing a regulatory or compliance universe at the moment, it's very challenging. There's a huge amount of, as you're referencing, new regulation coming on stream, but it's also got some of those really good aspects of having technology to support it. So as we look forward into 2025, I think we're going to see a lot more technology-enabled capturing of the regulatory universe that applies to companies. That ability to do horizon scanning across the overall range of compliance obligations that may be there. And that just allows, with that technological enablement, people to elevate some of their governance roles. So they're kept out of the weeds of having to do really detailed analysis on a manual basis and can have more of a top-down view on it. So I'm pretty excited as to what that's going to look like in 2025. In terms of some of the specifics, I do think areas like AML are going to become an increasing focus. We've seen a huge amount of RegTech innovation in that area. It continues to be, despite the quality of some of the technology innovation, a real challenge for a number of organizations, and it has been a very big focus point for regulators. So if I were to call out one, and I know there are many, that I can see emerging even more strongly during 2025, I think the AML as a broader support for the wider governance piece is going to play.
Okay, fantastic. So the best of times and the worst of times. Yes. John, Ian has mentioned horizon scanning and AML and various other things. How have advancements in AI and machine learning transformed the capabilities of RegTech solutions?
If you look at, say, 10 years ago when I would have started this, this was a predominantly manual area. You had a small number of really end-of-life solutions providing feeds. If you look at where we are today, and what good compliance looks like everywhere is proactive compliance. It's, in other words, it takes a large firm about 2 years to implement a large regulation or a regulatory change. It takes a mid-sized firm anywhere between 6 and 12 months to do it. So really our core business really is horizon scanning, and that's really about facilitating our clients to be able to see things, interpret and understand things way ahead of that. It uses AI, but we use AI trained by subject matter experts. So instead of lawyers doing things manually, lawyers are actually training models, and it's doing a number of things. It's giving you immediacy, so you can see things immediately as they happen. But actually, it's also giving you incredible accuracy. So we operate off a greater than 99% level of accuracy. If a lawyer is looking at a document and analysing a document, it's about 97% accurate. So it's transformational in terms of immediately getting the information, the accuracy of the information, and then making that information actionable in terms of doing the right things. Because the bottom line is, the other thing about reg change that's happening all the time is fines are happening all the time as well. This is a very heavily fined industry, both in terms of legal consequence of being fined and the financial consequence of being fined are horrific. Okay,
thanks, John and Chris. I mean, what transformational capabilities are you seeing?
Yeah. So Ian mentioned about firms being in the weeds as part of those regulatory changes, and I think John's example there of 2 years, or between a year and 2 years for reg change, is probably frightening at this day and age, I think. So we always think about it internally as firms are looking for a way to more quickly, smartly, innovatively, whatever the right phrase might be, is to collect, analyse and report on data. So John, you mentioned the different feeds, for example. So how can we collect that, almost remove the human to a certain extent? How can we automate that horizon scanning, push that out to the relevant people in the business? But then quickly then, instead of the traditional kind of, right, send an Excel spreadsheet back to the head of risk or the head of compliance and they have to analyze the data, how can we use AI or machine learning to almost quickly scan that, flag the reds or amber issues, and almost move to a more reporting by exception, rather than of this cycle of gathering the information, not having time to analyze it because we're suddenly hitting our board meeting deadline, and then that cycle is never ending. So it's like we're missing that bit in the middle sometimes. And really that's where we see firms looking to do, is want to streamline the collection of the data across the firm from multiple different feeds. If they're a large firm, maybe a smaller firm, it's more straightforward. Analysing it through some sort of automatic kind of flagging system, red, amber, green, if it's an internal threshold, and then reporting. Our clients want to move close to real-time reporting. A lot of firms are still stuck in this thing of the cut-off point is the 30th of the month, and we report, the board gets to review the report on the 11th of the month. So looking at ways we can use AI and machine learning just to move more towards a real-time alerting system and real-time reporting to non-execs and execs as well.
Okay, so really transformational capabilities making the work life easier.
Absolutely, yeah, that's it, yeah. And probably taking a bit of the burden, just that manual burden away from traditionally kind of the second line team, I suppose, where they're spending a lot of time just kind of building report templates, PowerPoints and things like that. And they really want to move to more high impact work. And it's almost difficult to action the data because you spend all your time collecting and analysing and reporting. You actually can't go out and fix the fire, put out the fire, if that makes sense.
Right, okay, thanks Chris. And if I could change tack slightly and come back to you, John, you know, with the elections last year in Ireland and the US, what political shifts do you see maybe impacting the RegTech industry, if any?
Well, a couple of things. I think the main topic here is regulatory divergence. So if you look at Europe, it's on a very direct path in terms of regulating AI, in terms of further regulation around GDPR and privacy of the person. And also it's very concerned about consumer protections and so on. I think if you look at the US, you're probably going to see a shift in terms of regulation, not necessarily less regulation, but different regulation. So regulation around labour law will probably have a very big impact. There's other types of regulations. So there may be some regulations de-emphasised and other regulations re-emphasised. So what does that mean? It means a global firm will actually have to use technology because there's going to be such a diversity of regulation and such a divergence of regulation that regulation is going to become so different in different jurisdictions that technology is needed.
On that note, I just want to bring Chris in there. How can companies ensure they are compliant across multiple jurisdictions?
Absolutely. So John alluded to, I think you have no option but to roll out technology. So you mentioned that divergence of regulatory. One of the examples we have that we see quite clearly, particularly a lot of our clients with multi-jurisdiction, clients are investing a lot of, our firms are investing a lot of time and money into things like ESG or carbon accounting and just trying to be more kind of sustainable in general. We see that shift in the EU under CSRD, for example, but now a lot of our firms are kind of saying actually, or a lot of our clients are now kind of saying, well, actually under a potential new US government, what happens if that law gets weakened? We suddenly have this real robust regulation or legislation in that we're operating in the EU and we want to roll out a RegTech to help that. But in the US, you might get less buy-in because the CEO, COO, whatever might say, actually, do you know what, it's just not a thing here. So that regulatory divergence is going to be a real challenge, particularly as potential legislation or regulation gets weakened on either side of the ocean. So I don't think firms have a choice but to roll out RegTech.
Right, so some complicated possibilities ahead. Ian, have you any observations on that?
I think I fully agree with Chris. I think when you look at the extent of the regulatory universe that many firms are faced with at the moment, having a single version of the truth across your footprint is extremely important, and that can only really be tech enabled. And there is a broader point as well as it comes to regulation and working in a regulatory environment, and it's quite rare actually that someone gets high-fived for getting the compliance and the regulation right. From an individual's perspective and a career enjoyment perspective, there can be a lot of downside risk. You really sometimes only get recognised if it goes slightly wrong.
Right.
And I think the technology allows people to get more enjoyment out of the role because they're doing less of the manual stuff. It allows them to have more of an assurance base given that you will have a better technology enabled basis on which to perform your role. And then coming back to the points that both Chris and John have made in relation to then supporting MI through governance is really, really helpful in that context as well. And keeping alive then in that environment too, how regulation is changing is pretty important as well. And just for a moment to reference some of the noise in a positive way in some respects that we're hearing in the context of the recent US election results. I mean, essentially the narrative that I hear from some of my US colleagues is the US is saying to itself, we've got the best banks in the world on the East Coast. We've got the best fintechs in the world on the West Coast. For some reason, they don't really talk to each other. Why is that? And someone has said, well, that's due to regulation, because the people on the East Coast find it difficult to bring the fintechs into a regulated world, and the fintechs do not want to be in a regulated world. So they're looking at ways to make that, as you've said, John, more adaptive rather than necessarily being relaxed or reduced, and having an ability to capture that in your horizon scanning in line with what is a very, very broad range of regulation that is already in place. It has to be technology enabled, and I think through that you'll get better compliance, and people hopefully, I think, will find a much more enjoyable career experience with it as well.
Oh, well, that's a very refreshing viewpoint, I think. And Chris, if I could come back to you just on one particular factor, given the increasing reliance on third-party vendors, can RegTech help organisations manage those risks a bit more effectively?
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of those key growth areas for us as a business as well at the moment. So the introduction of things like the Digital Operation Resilience Act right across the EU, and even locally here a couple of years back, we had the Central Bank of Ireland's outsourcing guidelines released for financial services firms as well. So it's a very fragmented process today. Clients have someone who will on board out here in procurement or in finance, someone else in the IT security team will do a due diligence check, someone else will raise a purchase order, but the person who actually uses the system almost feels detached from the process. So we see a kind of a need for a platform that can almost take the whole A to Z. So I want to go and onboard a new vendor, right? Here's my due diligence checklist I send them, here's all the regulatory information I need from the Central Bank of Ireland, or to do my register of information, satisfy my outsourcing register and everything else in between. So a lot of organizations move into platforms that can help that full onboarding and offboarding cycle as well as being able to tick all those regulatory boxes along that journey too.
Okay, so mitigating the risks. And John, if I could bring you in there, what about the RegTech platforms processing vast amounts of sensitive data? I mean, how can companies balance compliance with the ethical considerations of that?
There's a couple of things, and I think if you look at, say, Europe and the US, and maybe just talk about that for a second, because they will have very different attitudes in terms of that. But firstly, if you look at RegTech and primarily what it does, it processes publicly available information from regulators, which is primarily what regulation does. Now, one of the things about AI regulation is that AI regulation goes back to data, and it goes back to the provenance of data. So you're using data. Did you lawfully obtain that data? And so what's actually not well understood is firms have to get permissions from regulators in order to do it. But really 90% of what's in the system is actually basically publicly available information from regulators that's analysed. The other part of it, in terms of where people are using sensitive information, in terms of policies, in terms of impact analysis, that can all be put into something that's quite secure. What I would like to do quickly, if it's okay, is just go to something that you said, Ian, because I think it's really interesting in terms of the US, in terms of banks in the East Coast and technology in the West Coast. About 30% of our business is with payment companies that are all big techs. So what's very interesting as an observation is they will do a procurement process for RegTech in about 2 months, and they will implement it in between 4 to 6 months. In a tier 1 bank, the procurement process is 18 months, which is a real problem actually for our business model. Then the implementation cycle can be anywhere from 18 to 30 months. So if you look at payments, I don't think there will be any banks in payments in the next 5 to 10 years, because anywhere, and the other thing about big tech is being more regulated. And as it's becoming more regulated, it's less afraid of getting into regulated businesses. So I think one of the things that's going to happen, and it's mainly through new entrants, really the big tech getting into financial services, is they eat technology. These are technology companies that can implement projects and get projects done really quickly. And I think this is going to completely change the dynamic of the industry.
Okay, thanks, John. And Ian, anything that you'd like to pick up on what John has said, I suppose particularly about the ethical considerations?
Yeah, I think this one is such an important conversation point, not just for RegTech, but for financial services more broadly. But when you look at the AI aspects in particular, it's one of the few areas where you hear industry calling out for a clearer direction in regulation. And I'm sure there's a nicer way to express this, but a number of the CEOs that I talk to, and some of these have said this publicly, is they don't want to be sitting in front of a tribunal in 10 or 15 years being measured against a playing field that hasn't been articulated.
Right.
They're actually welcoming more direction when it comes to some of those ethical considerations, and making sure that that's appropriately adhered to has to be technology enabled. I mean, a huge amount of what we see is through a customer lens now, and in that context, making sure that products are ethically balanced, the right consumer protection is brought into it is hugely important. And in that, you've got this little bit of a trade-off between what in many respects are the demands, the wants, the needs of customers to have fantastic UX and CX. And actually, in many cases, they will prefer that over price when it comes to rate setting or otherwise, with the need to have some of that regulated. And again, let's be honest, regulation is contrary to the human condition, or it wouldn't exist.
Right.
So, we've got to find ways to make sure that those ethical considerations are built in a as frictionless as possible way, but clearly making sure that those are respected over time is going to be hugely important. So I do think that's an important balance to find, but not an easy one.
Not an easy one. And if we explore that a little bit, how can companies future-proof their compliance and risk strategies?
Yeah, well, again, to pick up on some of the points from earlier, I think that the manual capture of this is just gone. It's, I think, a road to nowhere unless you're an extremely small-scale operation. Having that clear universe with automated tracking of obligations where possible, clear MI passed through the governance chain is hugely important. So that can and should help future-proof, and certainly, as John was referencing, moving more to a forward-looking preventative regime where RegTech can play a part is hugely helpful. Do I see it in terms of full 100% future-proofing? No, I think no one would really aim for that bar. Would it reduce fines over time? Possibly. I don't think so in the immediacy, actually, if I'm being honest. I think a lot of the fines that we've seen in the recent past have been down to active policy decisions. That being said, there are some where technology has been used to get beyond controls, etc., that have caused entities not to do the right thing. But over time, where technologies allow for a better detection of inappropriate activities, etc., that should balance out over time as well.
Okay, very interesting. Well, I think we have time for one more question, and I would like to ask you all about future trends. So Ian, if we started with you, where do you see the most significant breakthroughs in RegTech happening in the next, let's say, 5 years?
I'm really excited about this, I have to say. And I see it across a number of different areas. Firstly, in the context of some of the immediacy, so the next 1 or 2 years, I see a lot of activity at present in the context of testing automation for second and third line activities. So compliance internal audit that was previously people ticketing time is heavily AI driven and machine learned. And that's just present here and now, and I can see that taking more and more hold. The level of automation from an AI perspective is increasing. I mean, one of my clients who I was speaking with earlier this week, he runs the trading platforms for one of the global asset managers, and he was just saying to me, his team in Ireland is about 120. By the end of 2025, he expects that to be something like 80. So he's going to lose a third of his headcount through ChatGPT, because it can do the coding and the versioning that previously he would have had humans doing. So that automation is going to be a huge feature, I think, in the near term as well. And as I look beyond that, as I've referenced, the continuing balance of customer user experience with some of the ethical considerations will continue to play. So I think this is going to be a very busy space. And as I was saying to John and to Chris earlier today, I've got this slide that I present to some of my global and European colleagues around what the FinTech and RegTech universe looks like in Ireland. And I do that quarterly. And the first thing I say every time I present it is, I can guarantee by the end of this conversation, it's out of date.
Wow,
because it's
imagine.
changing so quickly. So lots of good things ahead.
Lots of good things. Possibly not so good for workers, though, maybe.
I think there's probably a flip side on that. I mean, these people will all be moving into different roles predominantly.
Right. Okay.
But certainly the impact of technology is going to have a deeper impact in the near term in terms of what people are doing, as opposed to if they are doing anything at all.
Okay, understood. John, what about you? What do you see happening in the next 5 years?
Well, I think just following on from Ian's point, I think really two main things. One is I think where we're going to go, because there's a lot of us there here and now, is traceability in decision making. So if you look at ethics, so I think really where the regulator really wants to go is to decide how decisions were made, what impacts those decisions, because particularly in the UK, they have a concept of treating customers fairly, which is supposed to go right through every part of financial services. So really to see have they kind of followed those guidelines in terms of what they're doing. So actually, if you look at what compliance will be about, I think it's going to be about two things. It's actually going to be about speeding up business and enabling business. So it's a business enablement function rather than some break that's on the business as people see it today. So I think it's going to be a more exciting place to be. And the second thing is, it's also probably where the ethics and the conscience of an organization is going to be. So the tools will actually allow the tracking of decisions that have not been brilliant for different stakeholders.
Okay, so speed and transparency. And Chris, what about you? What do you foresee happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm picking up on both Ian and John's points around the second line of defence or the third line of defence maybe not being high-fived as much for rollout of RegTech. I think what we're going to see is almost that a RegTech platform or a marketplace infiltrating everywhere in the business, if that makes sense, so that the first line are using it a lot more and allowing the second line to probably demonstrate much more value, so becoming an enabler. So when things like consumer duty are released, we're not kind of looking at it on the 11th hour and saying, what is this and how do we demonstrate compliance? When the consumer protection codes here in Ireland change, that we're much more proactive rather than this laboursome process of, right, we need to go out and do horizon scanning, now we need to go put it in an Excel spreadsheet, report on it, that we can just become much more, right, we want to launch a new product, have we considered this, this and this, and then being able to push a button to evidence that we've done so. So I think it's going to give the second line and third line a lot more power to demonstrate that they're an enabler to the business, rather than the break that you maybe described, John, of them being seen as maybe a hurdle that we need to get over to do a new product launch, for example.
Okay, well, watch this space. Well, that's all we have time for right now. Really interesting and insightful discussion there. Lots of takeaways and ideas of what's to come. I hope you all feel equipped and prepared for the rest of the year. I certainly do. Thanks again to Ian Nelson, Chris Hanlon and John Byrne for joining us today.